I never thought it would happen, not like this. Not with him. The silence of the house felt like a living, breathing thing, amplifying every glance, every unspoken word, every accidental touch. It made the tension between us feel heavier, more forbidden, more electric. When he walked into my room that night, the world seemed to tilt, shifting the delicate balance we had tried so hard to maintain. Something passed between us, silent yet unmistakable, a force neither of us could deny any longer. I knew it was wrong. Every logical thought in my head screamed that it was wrong. Yet, as he stood there in the doorway, his eyes meeting mine with a raw, unspoken longing, all my carefully constructed defenses crumbled. His presence alone unraveled me. It was as if the air itself had changed, thick with emotions we couldn't name but could no longer ignore. That moment, something fundamental broke loose. A boundary crossed, and I knew there was no going back. The house was cloaked in a stillness that only deep night could bring, the kind of quiet that makes every creak of the floorboards and every sigh of the wind seem louder than it should. Outside, the moon hung low, its silver light spilling through the windows, illuminating the hallways in an ethereal, ghostly glow. Shadows danced along the walls, adding an almost surreal quality to the moment. I lay in my room, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to focus on anything but the storm brewing inside me. My phone lay discarded on the nightstand, its screen dark, forgotten. I tried reading earlier, but the words blurred together, meaningless against the cacophony of thoughts in my mind. Thoughts of him. They invaded my quiet moments, persistent and relentless, like the tide against the shore. No matter how hard I tried to resist, he was always there, his image, his voice, the way he moved, the way he looked at me. He hadn't been in my life for long, just a few months, really, but it felt like he had always been there. Like his presence had rooted itself in my existence without me even realizing it. Ever since my mom married him, everything had shifted. First, I told myself it was nothing, just the awkwardness of adjusting to a new family dynamic. But the more time I spent around him, the harder it became to dismiss the tension that crackled between us like static electricity. It wasn't just me, either. I could see it in the way his gaze lingered a moment too long, the way his hand would brush mine at the dinner table and hesitate for just a fraction of a second too much. It was in the silence that stretched between us when we found ourselves alone, the way he would clear his throat and look away as though he couldn't trust himself to speak. These moments, small, fleeting, but significant, became a language of their own, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken but undeniable. I told myself over and over again that it was wrong. I reminded myself of the lines that shouldn't be crossed, of the consequences that loomed like dark clouds on the horizon. He was my stepfather now. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for these feelings that had taken root and grown wild despite my best efforts to uproot them. And yet, the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they became, like a fire fed by the very act of trying to smother it. That night, the air in my room felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. The distant ticking of the clock was the only sound, each second a reminder of how trapped I felt in my own thoughts. I heard the soft creak of footsteps outside my door and froze, my breath catching in my throat. A gentle knock followed, a sound so quiet it was almost imperceptible. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending to be asleep, hoping whoever it was would go away. But then the door opened, and he stepped inside. The sight of him standing there, framed by the dim light from the hallway, made my pulse race. He looked different tonight, less composed, more vulnerable. His usual confident demeanor had been stripped away, replaced by something raw and uncertain. He hesitated in the doorway, as if debating whether he should leave before either of us said something we couldn't take back. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured, his voice low and strained. "I know I shouldn't." For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, charged with emotions we had both tried to bury. My mind screamed at me to tell him to leave, to protect us both from the path we were about to walk down. But my heart had other plans. I sat up, my breath unsteady, unable to tear my eyes away from him. When he finally crossed the room and sat on the edge of my bed, the space between us felt both impossibly wide and unbearably close. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was giving himself time to reconsider. "I've been trying to fight this," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to do the right thing, to keep my distance, but it's getting harder. Every time I see you, every time we're alone, I can't stop thinking about you." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything we had avoided saying. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to tell him he wasn't alone, that I felt it too, that I had been fighting the same battle, losing just as miserably, but the words caught in my throat, and all I could manage was a shaky whisper. "I feel it too," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I've felt it for a while." He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, a warmth that spread through my chest and made it impossible to think clearly. His touch was tender, almost reverent, as though he was afraid I might pull away. "I don't want to hurt you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "but I don't know how to stop this." I looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, any sign that he might step back and give us both an out. But there was none. I saw only longing, mirrored by my own. Whatever thin thread of restraint we had clung to was gone now, frayed beyond repair. "I don't want you to stop," I whispered, the words escaping before I could think better of them. "I don't want this to end." In that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just the two of us, caught in a storm we couldn't escape, bound by a connection that defied logic, reason, or morality. It was reckless, it was wrong, but it was real. And as he leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin, I realized I was powerless to resist. Slowly, he closed the remaining distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in the softest, most tentative of kisses. It was as if he were testing the waters, gauging my reaction, afraid of crossing a boundary we couldn't undo. First, the kiss felt like a gentle whisper, hesitant and unsure. But as our lips moved together, that hesitation dissolved like snow in the sun. Passion, raw and undeniable, began to surface, a force that had been simmering silently for months, waiting for this moment to erupt. His hand slid behind my neck, fingers tangling softly in my hair, and pulled me closer, as if the space between us was unbearable. The kiss deepened, growing more confident, more insistent, and I found myself responding in kind. My own hand traveled upward, pressing against the firmness of his chest, feeling the heat of his body through the thin fabric of his shirt. My heart was pounding, a wild rhythm that echoed the electricity surging between us. Each touch ignited sparks beneath my skin, leaving me breathless with a need I didn't know could exist. There were no barriers now, no distance. It was just him and me, a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to sweep us away completely. The world outside ceased to exist, no rules, no responsibilities, no prying eyes. Time felt suspended as our kisses grew hungrier, more desperate, as if trying to reclaim every moment we had spent denying what we felt. I could feel the weight of his emotions in every movement, the way his hands explored cautiously, reverently, as though he feared breaking something fragile. I had never felt anything like this before, the intensity, the longing, the overwhelming need to be closer even when there was no more space left between us. My body hummed with anticipation, my senses heightened to every touch, every sigh. It was as if he had unlocked a part of me I hadn't known existed, and I was powerless to resist. But even in the heat of the moment, reality crept in like a shadow. The weight of the consequences loomed over us, a silent reminder of what we stood to lose. As much as I wanted to surrender completely, I couldn't ignore the risks. I broke away, my breathing ragged, my heart racing. "We have to be careful," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "We can't let anyone know." His gaze locked with mine, filled with a mixture of frustration and determination. "I know," he said softly, his breath uneven, "but I don't care anymore. I don't care if it's wrong. I don't care what anyone thinks. I want you." His words hit me like a lightning strike, sending a jolt through my entire being. For a moment, everything else faded into insignificance. All I could think about was him, the way his touch ignited something primal within me, the way his words made my heart ache with equal parts fear and longing. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. The reality of our situation crashed over me like a wave, cold and sobering. My breath caught, panic surging in my chest as I pulled away further, my eyes darting toward the door. "We have to stop," I said, my voice shaky and filled with urgency. "We can't let them catch us." He exhaled heavily, frustration etched across his features. But he nodded. The tension between us was palpable, an unspoken agreement that neither of us wanted this to end but knew it had to, at least for now. He stood, running a hand through his disheveled hair, his expression torn between regret and resolve. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and laced with guilt. "I didn't mean to put you in this position." I shook my head, stepping toward him without hesitation. "Don't apologize," I said firmly. "I wanted this too." We stood there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words, our breath still unsteady. The weight of what we had just done pressed heavily on us, but so did the undeniable pull that had brought us to this moment. I didn't know what would come next, didn't know how we would navigate the impossible terrain ahead. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. His hand reached out again, brushing against my cheek with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "We'll figure this out," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine with unwavering determination. "I promise." And despite everything, despite the risks, the rules, the looming consequences, I believed him, because in that moment, it wasn't just his words I trusted. It was the fire in his eyes, the conviction in his touch, and the knowledge that we were in this together. Whatever storms awaited us, we would face them as one. We lingered, the silence between us speaking volumes. His fingers traced the curve of my jaw, the simple gesture conveying more than words ever could. I could feel the tension crackling like static electricity, a force pulling us together even as logic begged us to stay apart. "I don't want this to end," he whispered, his voice raw and filled with longing. His thumb brushed against my lips, and I felt my resolve slipping once more. There was no denying what I felt for him, no way to suppress the torrent of emotions raging inside me. He made me feel alive in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. But as much as I wanted to give in, the sound of another distant noise brought me back to reality. I stepped away reluctantly, my heart aching with the effort. "We can't let this go too far," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not here. Not like this." He nodded, though the frustration in his eyes mirrored my own. "I know," he said, his voice steady but filled with unspoken promises. "But this isn't over." And as I watched him leave, his words lingered in the air, filling me with equal parts hope and dread, because deep down, I knew he was right. This was only the beginning. Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos. If you find the content useful and interesting, don't forget to like, share, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update attractive, inspiring, and useful content for you. Click the bell icon to receive notifications as soon as there are new videos. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue to develop. Thank you and see you in the next videos.